I got a $100 per hour night job at Speedway gas. There are strange rules to follow. Life hasn't treated me well. Name's Nate, 29 years old, and I'm the textbook definition of wasted potential. I dropped out of high school thinking I was going to be the next Eddie Vedder. Played in a few bands, smoked way too much weed, and then, well, things went downhill fast. Drugs took control of my life, and before I realized it, I was just another washed-up guy with a beat-up Chevy Malibu and a pocket full of regrets. I was driving down some deserted back road in Indiana, the kind where endless cornfields stretch in every direction and the only thing breaking the monotony is the occasional dilapidated barn. My car was sputtering, and I was just hoping it would hold out until I found a gas station. That's when I saw it, a flyer slapped onto a telephone pole. Help wanted overnight clerk. Night shift. $100 per hour. Apply in person at Speedway, exit 92 on I-65. $100 an hour for a night shift at a Speedway? That was more than I'd ever made in a week playing music. My gut told me something wasn't right, but desperation can make you ignore your instincts. I pulled into the lot, the flickering neon sign humming like a swarm of angry insects. The place looked like it hadn't seen a renovation since the 80s, peeling paint, cracked windows, and a vibe that made my skin crawl. I stepped inside, the bell above the door chiming like an omen. The man behind the counter looked pale, like he hadn't been outside in years. He didn't say a word, just handed me a clipboard with a single sheet of paper.
Read the rules.
He muttered, his tone flat.
Follow them or don't. But if you don't, you won't make it through the night.
I glanced at the paper, 7 rules typed out in bold, all caps. They felt off, unsettling in a way that made my stomach tighten. But $100 an hour? I scrawled my name at the bottom. Biggest mistake of my life. The guy, his name was Hank, gave me the rundown. Shift starts at 10 p.m., ends at 6 a.m. You're here alone the entire time. No deliveries, no visitors, no exceptions. He handed me a set of keys and a flashlight. Keep this on you. The power cuts out sometimes. I chuckled, thinking he was messing with me. Power cuts out at a gas station? He didn't smile.
Just follow the rules.
The rules were pinned to the wall behind the counter, laminated like they were some sacred doctrine. I read them over and over, trying to make sense of them. If the lights flicker, lock the doors immediately. Do not open them for anyone, no matter how much they beg. If you hear a child crying outside, do not look out the windows. Turn up the radio and wait until it stops. The freezer door must always stay closed. If you hear knocking from inside, ignore it. Even if the knocking turns into screaming, do not open it. Every hour, check the security cameras. If you see a figure in the parking lot, do not acknowledge it. It will leave if you act like it isn't there. If a customer comes in wearing a red jacket, do not make eye contact. Serve them quickly and do not speak unless absolutely necessary. At 3:33 a.m., the register will open by itself. Take exactly $333 and place it in the donation jar by the door. Do not keep the change. If you see a man in a black suit standing by the gas pumps, do not step outside. Stay inside until sunrise, no matter how long it takes. It seemed like some bizarre joke, maybe a hazing ritual for new employees. But as the night dragged on, I began to notice things. Around midnight, the lights flickered. I followed the rules, locking the doors right away. A few minutes later, someone started pounding on the glass, pleading to be let inside. I didn't look. At 2 a.m., I heard crying. It sounded like a little girl right outside the door. My hand hovered over the lock, but I remembered the rules. I cranked up the radio and waited. The sobbing stopped after a few minutes. By 3:33, I was sweating bullets. The register popped open, and I took the money like the rules instructed. The donation jar was ice cold, like it had been pulled from a deep freezer. I checked the cameras at 4 a.m. A shadowy figure stood in the parking lot, facing the store. It hadn't been there before. I avoided looking outside. The final hour was the worst. The man in the black suit arrived, standing motionless by the gas pumps, his gaze locked onto the store. I didn't dare leave. When the sun finally rose, I was exhausted but still alive. Hank came in to relieve me.
You made it,
He said, as if he were genuinely surprised. I didn't mention the strange things I had seen. I just left, hoping it had all been in my imagination. But it wasn't. I didn't want to go back. I really didn't. But $100 an hour? That was more money than I'd ever seen in my life. And besides, I convinced myself, maybe the first night was a fluke. Maybe I had just been overtired. Or high. Or something. I showed up at 9:45 p.m., my hands shaking as I unlocked the door. Hank was there, looking just as hollow-eyed and drained as before, like he hadn't had a proper night's sleep in years.
You actually came back,
He said, sounding almost doubtful. Yeah, I replied, trying to sound unfazed. It's just a gas station, right? He didn't respond, simply handed me the keys and walked out. The first few hours were eerily still. Too still. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I kept glancing at the security monitors, but the parking lot remained empty. No sounds. No disturbances. No nothing. Then, around 1 a.m., the freezer started making noise. At first, it was a faint tapping, like someone lightly knocking from the inside. My body froze, heart hammering against my ribs. The rules were clear, ignore it. But what if someone was stuck in there? What if it was a kid? The knocking grew louder. Then, it turned into full-on banging, like something was hurling itself against the door. I could hear voices now, muffled, pleading. Let us out, they begged. Please, let us out. I almost gave in. My hand hovered over the handle. But then I remembered the rules and yanked myself back, trembling. The banging faded after a few minutes, and the voices dissolved into silence. My legs felt weak, barely able to hold me up. I checked the monitors again, and that's when I saw it, a figure, standing motionless in the parking lot, facing the store. It hadn't been there before. I refused to look outside. At 3:33 a.m., the register drawer shot open again. I took the cash and placed it into the donation jar, my fingers brushing against something cold and clammy. I refused to glance down. The man in the black suit arrived at 4:30 a.m., just like before. He stood near the gas pumps, watching the store. Unmoving. Unblinking. I stayed put. When the sun finally rose, I was completely drained. Hank arrived, took one look at me, and said,
You actually made it.
Yeah, I croaked, my throat dry. What the hell is this place? He didn't answer, just handed me my paycheck and left. By the third night, I was questioning my sanity. The rules, the noises, the figures lurking in the dark, it was all too much. But $100 an hour? That was hard to turn down. So I convinced myself to tough it out, follow the instructions, and push through it. The shift started like before. Hank handed me the keys, shot me that same lifeless stare, and walked away without saying a word. I was alone again, the flickering neon sign humming like a nest of angry wasps. The first few hours were uneventful, but I could feel it, the tension, the weight in the air like something unseen was pressing against me. I kept checking the cameras, but the lot remained deserted. No cries. No knocks. Nothing. Then, just past midnight, the lights flickered. My hands were shaking as I locked the doors, barely able to turn the key. Moments later, a fist pounded against the glass. Please, a voice whimpered. Let me in. They're out here. I didn't look. I couldn't. The rules were absolute. The knocking stopped after a while, and the lights returned to normal. I checked the security feed, and there it was, a figure, planted in the parking lot, facing the store. It hadn't been there before. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling of being watched refused to leave me. I turned up the radio, but the static only made it worse. At 2 a.m., the crying started again. This time, it was louder. Desperate. I turned up the volume, but it was no use. The sobbing was everywhere, outside, inside, in my skull. I checked the monitors, and the figure was closer. Just a few feet from the entrance. I refused to look outside. At 3:33 a.m., the register popped open. I took the cash, dropped it in the donation jar, and my hand brushed against something slick and slimy. I didn't let myself react. At 4:30 a.m., the man in the black suit appeared again. Standing in the exact same spot. Still as stone. I didn't move. By sunrise, I was barely functioning. Hank arrived, gave me a look, and muttered,
"You're still here."
"Yeah," I rasped. "What the hell is happening?" No response. He handed me my paycheck and left. By the fourth night, I wasn't sure if I was awake or dreaming. My hands trembled like I was going through withdrawal, and my head felt packed with cotton. But $100 an hour? That kind of money makes you ignore every warning sign screaming at you to run. I pulled into the Speedway lot just before 10 p.m., my Chevy Malibu's engine wheezing like it was ready to die. The neon sign flickered erratically, buzzing louder than usual. Hank was inside, looking worse than ever, like he hadn't slept in a lifetime.
"You're back,"
he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Yeah," I muttered, trying to sound like I wasn't rattled. "Nothing here I can't handle." He didn't crack a smile. Just handed me the keys and left without another word. The first few hours dragged on an eerie silence, but it was the kind that made your skin crawl. The steady hum of the coolers. The occasional flicker of the overhead lights. The quiet groaning of the building settling into itself. It all felt too loud. Too close. I kept stealing glances at the rules pinned to the wall, their words burning into my mind like a permanent brand. Just past midnight, the lights flickered. My stomach dropped. I quickly locked the doors as instructed, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it pulsing in my throat. A moment later, someone started banging on the glass. "Please," a voice pleaded. "Let me in. They're outside." I didn't look. I wouldn't. The rules were clear. The pounding lasted for a few agonizing minutes before silence returned, and the lights stabilized. I checked the cameras, and that's when I spotted it, a figure in the parking lot, standing motionless, staring at the store. It hadn't been there before. I tried to ignore it, but a gnawing sense of unease clawed at me. I turned up the radio, but the static only made it worse. At 2 a.m., the crying started again. This time, it was louder. More frantic. I cranked up the radio, but it did nothing to drown out the sound. It was coming from everywhere, outside, inside, echoing in my skull. I checked the cameras again, and the figure had moved closer. It was now just a few feet from the entrance. I refused to look outside. At 3:33 a.m., the register sprang open. I grabbed the money and dropped it into the donation jar, my fingertips brushing against something cold and slick. I didn't allow myself to look. At 4:30 a.m., the man in the black suit returned. He stood beside the gas pumps, unmoving, his gaze locked onto the store. I didn't move an inch. When the sun finally rose, I was wrecked. Hank arrived, took one look at me, and muttered,
"You're still here."
"Yeah," I croaked, my throat raw. "What the hell is happening here?" He said nothing, just handed me my paycheck and left. By the fifth night, I had stopped caring about the rules. The money was good, sure, but something else kept pulling me back. Maybe it was defiance. Maybe it was stupidity. Or maybe I was just too damn exhausted to care anymore. The nightmares were starting to bleed into my waking hours. I'd hear that infernal knocking in my sleep, and the man in the black suit would be waiting at the foot of my bed when I jolted awake. But still, I kept coming back. Hank wasn't there when I arrived. The door was already unlocked, the keys tossed carelessly on the counter. The entire place felt off, colder, darker, like the walls were closing in. The neon sign outside buzzed weakly, flickering so badly that the walls seemed to pulse with it. I didn't even glance at the rules. By now, they were burned into my memory. Midnight passed. No flickering lights. No crying. Just the persistent hum of the coolers and the slow ticking of the clock. I started to believe maybe it was over. Maybe whatever was playing with me had lost interest. Then, at 1:07 a.m., the freezer started screaming. Not knocking. Not pleading. Screaming. Human voices, raw and agonized, wailing as if they were being torn apart. Nate, one of them shrieked, and my blood ran cold. They knew my name. Let us out, Nate. You owe us. My hands trembled so violently that I dropped the flashlight. It rolled beneath the counter, and as I bent to grab it, I saw something. A dark stain on the floor. Rust-colored, old, but growing, seeping out from beneath the freezer door. Don't open it. Don't open it. Don't. I opened it. Dear friends, don't forget to subscribe. I really want to gather a community of true horror lovers. The cold hit me first, sharp enough to burn my lungs. Then came the stench, rotting meat and copper, so thick I could taste it. The freezer's light was dead, but my flashlight beam cut through the darkness, shaking in my grasp. No bodies. No people. Just raw meat. Stacked, wrapped in plastic, blood leaking through the seams. But the plastic wasn't right. Too smooth. Too shiny. Almost like it wasn't plastic at all. Then one of the packages moved. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet, and the flashlight clattered to the floor. The beam shot up toward the ceiling, and for a fraction of a second, I saw it, a figure, long and twisted, clinging to the rafters like a grotesque spider. Its skin was sickly pale, flayed in places, and its mouth, its mouth, was sewn shut with thick, black stitches. The freezer door slammed shut behind me. I scrambled up, fumbling for the flashlight, but the thing was gone. The screaming had stopped. The freezer hummed as if nothing had happened. But the stain on the floor had spread. Fresh, dark. I spent the rest of the night curled up behind the counter, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. The man in the black suit arrived early. 3 a.m. But this time, he wasn't alone. More figures stood at the edge of the parking lot, their dark silhouettes barely visible in the weak glow of the flickering sign. They didn't move. Didn't blink. Just stared. At 3:33 a.m., the register opened. I didn't touch the money. When Hank arrived at dawn, he didn't say a word. He just stared at the freezer door, then at me. His expression darkened, his eyes widening like he'd just seen a ghost.
You opened it,
he whispered. Yeah, I murmured, my voice empty. So what? He handed me my paycheck and walked out. This time, the money reeked of rot. The freezer wouldn't stop bleeding. I had mopped up the mess 3 times already, but the thick, tar-like pool kept seeping out, spreading across the tiles like it had a mind of its own. The entire place stank of rust and decay, so strong I could almost taste it. But I didn't care anymore. Rules? Forget the rules. I was finished being afraid. Hank hadn't come to hand off the keys. When I arrived, the door was already unlocked, creaking open in a way that sounded eerily like a chuckle. The lights inside were dimmer than usual, and for the first time, the neon sign outside wasn't flickering, it was completely dead. No buzzing. No glow. Just silence, thick and suffocating. I kicked the freezer door. Is that all you've got? Try harder. No response. For the first hour, nothing out of the ordinary happened. No flickering lights. No eerie cries. No shadowy figures lingering outside. Just me, the bloodstains, and the suffocating stench. Then, right around midnight, the radio crackled to life out of nowhere. First static, then a voice, rough and gravelly like it was speaking through a mouthful of dust. Nate, we know you're here. I yanked the plug from the wall. Somehow, the silence felt worse. At 1 a.m., the freezer started singing. A slow, haunting hymn, one my mother used to hum when I was a kid. Voices layered together, sweet yet rotten. I grabbed a crowbar from the back and jammed it beneath the freezer door. "Shut up!" I bellowed, forcing it open. A blast of frigid air poured out, along with a swarm of bloated black flies. They clung to the walls, the ceiling, my skin. I swung the crowbar wildly, hitting nothing but air. When the swarm finally cleared, the freezer was empty. No meat. No plastic-wrapped bundles. No twisted creature. Just a single Polaroid taped to the back wall. It was a picture of me. In the image, I stood behind the counter, my face gaunt, my eyes hollow. Behind me, reflected in the security mirror, was the man in the black suit. His hand rested on my shoulder. At the bottom of the photo, a date was scrawled in smudged ink, "Tonight." I crushed the photo in my trembling hand, my breaths coming in shallow gasps. That's when I heard the knocking at the front door. Not the freezer. The front door. A woman stood outside, her face pressed against the glass. She wore a red jacket. Rule number 5 flashed in my head: never make eye contact. But I had stopped caring. I locked eyes with her. "We're closed," I snapped. She smiled, her lips splitting unnaturally at the corners like old paper.
"You've been bad, Nate."
The door swung open on its own. A gust of cold air rushed in, carrying the scent of damp earth and gasoline. Behind her, the parking lot was full. Dozens of figures, all dressed in black suits, all watching me without blinking. The man from the gas pump stepped forward, his face finally visible under the flickering glow of the store lights. He looked familiar, like someone I had seen in old, forgotten photographs.
"Time to pay up,"
he said, his voice drilling into my skull. I bolted for the back door, but it wouldn't budge. The handle was coated in that same freezing, slimy substance from the donation jar. The figures inched closer, their shadows stretching across the floor, swallowing the light. The last thing I saw was the freezer door swinging open behind me. Then, nothing. The flyer is still there. Taped to the telephone pole at exit 92 on I-65. Help wanted overnight clerk. Night shift. $100 per hour. A new guy came in tonight. Young. Desperate. Reeking of weed and bad choices. Signed the paper without even skimming the rules. I watch him from the parking lot, my black suit fitting snug, my stitches keeping my jaw shut. Hank stands beside me, his face pale, his stare vacant. He's been here longer than I have. The new guy is laughing as he unlocks the door, thinking he hit the jackpot. He won't be laughing when the freezer starts knocking. Did you like the story? Who do you think Hank really is? And what happened to the gas station? Write your impressions in the comments, like and subscribe to the channel.